Photosynthesis is another chemical reaction that's critical to living things. And even though plants and other autotrophs are the main organisms to do it, all organisms on Earth really depend on photosynthesis. So I like to say that photosynthesis solar powers the Earth. The reason that I say that is because light enters the atmosphere and plants are able to capture that light energy. So here's light energy entering the atmosphere from the sun. Plants capture that energy and make sugars and oxygen. And then those sugars can be broken down through cellular respiration, this process that we've learned about already, and to release ATP that the cells then use to do work that releases CO2, and that can be recaptured by plants in photosynthesis. And so it's this big cycle where light energy comes in to the ecosystem and ATP and heat energy go out. And all organisms fundamentally rely on this. So if you think about it, maybe what you ate for breakfast this morning or what you had for lunch, you maybe had, a hamburger, so maybe you had the bun, which is plant matter. So obviously that came from the sun. But even if you think about the meat, that came from a cow. Cows ate plants in order to make that meat. And so fundamentally, everything that you eat can be brought back to photosynthesizers. So all of the energy and the organic compounds on Earth fundamentally are processed by plants. So plants are an example of an autotroph. Autotroph means self-nutrition. So they're able to make organic molecules from inorganic sources. So that means they're going to take carbon dioxide and turn it into organic molecules like sugars. More specifically, plants are photoautotrophs. That means they use light. Photo means light, in order to provide the energy to make those organic molecules. Photoautotrophs are mostly plants, that's the one we're familiar with, but it also includes a wide variety of other organisms. So things like seaweed, for example, in the ocean, protists, which are single-celled organisms that can do single-celled eukaryotes that could do photosynthesis, and many different types of bacteria. Everything else on Earth must eat autotrophs in one way or another, and they are called heterotrophs. So heterotroph means to eat others or to get nutrition from others. So they have to eat another living thing to extract organic molecules and get energy that they need for life. We are an example of a heterotroph. We have to eat other organisms in order to get energy and organic molecules. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water and the energy from light and hooks those carbon dioxides together into larger molecules. And in this case, this is glucose. So glucose, and it also produces oxygen, and it also produces water. So this is a giant redox reaction. CO2 is being reduced and H2O is being oxidized. So this is an endergonic process. It's requiring an input of energy because I'm taking smaller molecules and building larger molecules, and the energy to do that is going to come from light. You may notice that this is basically the opposite of cellular respiration. So instead of breaking down glucose, so having my arrow point the other direction, I am now making glucose. So cellular respiration is exergonic, photosynthesis is endergonic. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts, and these are specialized organelles in plants and algae that carry out photosynthesis. They have a distinct green color, which you hopefully remember from looking at the elodea in lab, and it's due to the presence of a pigment called chlorophyll. The leaf has layers to it. So this is the interior layer, and there's an exterior layer of cells. The majority of photosynthesis is occurring in this part called the central mesophyll. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this chapter. Another key feature of leaves is structures called stomata. These are the stomata in this image here, and their job is to let gases in and out of the leaf. So they're going to allow CO2 to go into the leaf and O2 to leave the leaf. The chloroplast is a complex organelle with multiple membranes. It has an outer membrane, an inner membrane, and then it has a third membrane called a thylakoid membrane. So this little stack here is the thylakoids. This fluid out here is called the stroma. And so the sort of key locations for photosynthesis are the stroma, the thylakoid, and the, excuse me, I'm just getting my pen here, are the thylakoid, the stroma, and the thylakoid lumen. So I'm going to draw that up here for you. So sorry, I was leaning over there getting my pen. So let me get the pen up here. So I'm just going to blow up the thylakoid a little bit. So I'm just focusing on the thylakoid. So I've got my inner membrane, my outer membrane. This is the thylakoid lumen. This is the stroma outside of the thylakoid. So I've just enlarged this part here. So the stroma and the thylakoid lumen and the membrane are the key parts that we're going to really be focusing on when we look at the light reactions. So make sure you're really familiar with those locations. So there's only 2 stages of photosynthesis, which I know is a relief after the 4 stages of cellular respiration. There are the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. The light reactions occur in the thylakoid, so that's why that location is going to be so important. So this is where light will actually be absorbed, hence the name light reactions. This is where oxygen will be produced as well. And the light reactions also produce ATP and NADPH. So basically, the light reactions are taking light energy and converting it into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. But it's not done because this is not what it wants to make. It wants to make sugar in this process. So that brings us to the second part, the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is going to use CO2 and energy, and that's that chemical energy from ATP and NADPH to make sugars. And the one we're going to focus on is glucose. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma, so that's why that location is important. So we have the thylakoid being the center of the light reactions and the stroma being the center of the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle then feeds back NAD plus and ADP to the light reactions. So remembering that they're interdependent on each other. Light reactions creates ATP and NADPH for the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle sends NADP plus and ADP back to the light reactions. And let me just as an aside, I didn't mention this yet, NADP is something we haven't seen before, but it's very chemically similar to NADH. So it forms through a reduction. So NADP plus is reduced to NADPH, and then just like with NADH, whoops, missed a D here, NADPH, to go back to NADP plus is an oxidation. So it's another energy intermediate, just like NADH, that's formed by redox reactions. So just to make sure you're paying attention, how do the reactant molecules needed for photosynthesis reach the chloroplast in the leaves? Well, first of all, what are the reactants? So remember, we need CO2, we need H2O, we need ADP, and NADPH. So in particular, these are being provided by the leaves. So CO2 is coming in through the stomata, and water is coming in through the veins from the roots. ADP and NADPH and ATP and NADP plus are going to cycle between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. So let me go back to that figure here. So we need water, and that's coming from the veins. We need CO2, that's coming from the stomata. The ADP, NADP plus, ATP, and NADPH are cycling between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. So how are the 2 stages of photosynthesis connected to each other? Well, hopefully you are connecting this. Again, I just said it. It's because ADP and ATP and NADPH and NADP plus cycle. So again, going back to that figure one more time, the Calvin cycle depends on the light reactions to provide ATP and NADPH, and the light reactions depend on the Calvin cycle to provide NADP plus and ADP plus. Oops. So that's the basic introduction to photosynthesis. We'll now go through each step of it in a little bit more detail.